Hey everybody, I'm Rachael and I'm here to talk to you about risk. And here is sort of the obligatory bit about why you should listen to me. I'm a risk enthusiast. I get really happy about talking about risk. Roman can tell you he came for more. I don't understand. I'm not a risk expert. I've been working in information security for 14 years and 9 of them have been in risk. I've got the usual alphabet soup of certifications. I'm currently working as a security strategist at Leviathan Security Group, which is pretty great because it means I get to talk about risk all day. So here's what we'll be doing, and here's sort of like how long stuff will take, hopefully. So who else here really likes risk? I know, right? And who really hates it or thinks it's stupid or whatever? Come on. Sometimes. Okay, good. This talk is really for that because I think that most of the reason people really hate risk is that it's so often so dumb. It's often done pretty badly. Have you ever seen the thing where, say, ops will refuse to patch a server and then it'll get owned and then they're like, information security, why didn't you fix that? And they're like, we told them it was a risk, but we're left holding the bag on the risk. Effectively, we're the ones signing off on all the risks, whether we want to or not. How many of you have seen this? Yeah? Yeah. Isn't that the best part of InfoSec? Yeah, I get a lot of nods. I think you're all being sarcastic. What do you think? You know, this whole talk is about stopping that. After this talk, hopefully, you'll know what risk is good for, know what a decent risk management program should actually look like, be able to set up a good enough program, cheap, which is kind of important when you're really small, be able to do a pretty simple risk assessment, and know what documentation will get you through an audit. The goal here is to crush your auditors, drown them in documentation, and hear the lamentations of your regulators. Right now, everything is risk-based. It's this sort of fairy dust that we sprinkle over everything, whether or not it has anything to do with actual risk. The auditors want it, the regulators want it, the frameworks want it, the customers want it, the stakeholders want it, marketing wants it, employers want it. I see so many resumes that talk about how much risk stuff they've done, and it's like, I'm looking at this and like, you're a mid-level Tivoli administrator. You have never touched risk, sorry. You know. I honestly think this is one of the unsolved problems in information security. We can't do risk at small scale. We can't figure things, we can't identify problems cleanly and get them fixed before they get really entrenched. This is like super technical debt. A minimum viable product, getting something working, rarely includes security or risk. And all these invisible risks just add up. Part of the problem is we have a lot of confusion about terms. Ask 3 people in security about what risk is. You will get 5 answers if you're lucky. You might get more. Here are the terms I'm going to use. They're straight out of FAIR, which we'll talk about later. It's possible, if not likely, that I will mess this up myself, even though I've been living and breathing this stuff for 10 years. It's actually pretty hard to keep it straight because the way the language works is sloppy. A risk is a threat, is a vuln, is a whatever. So what's risk in this talk? We're going to go with probable frequency and probable magnitude of future loss. An asset, something of value. Frequency is how often a loss may occur within a given time frame. And that's a little bit different from likelihood, because likelihood, what does that mean? Is it likely in the next 10 years or likely in the next millennium? Qualitative risk is expressed in words like rare, medium, and well done. Gotcha? Quantitative risk is expressed in numbers, dollars per time frame in our case. A threat is something that may act to cause a loss. A threat event is the thing the threat does that may cause that loss. A vulnerability is a weakness that may allow a threat to cause a loss. And in this case, our backup generator has escaped into the wild. You know, it's making a break for it. We don't have backup. Here's our loss event, the specific loss. And here is a secondary loss event, which is the reputation damage after our specific loss. So why have a risk management program? For most places, the answer is compliance. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Your program won't work if nobody cares. Binders full of auditor bane do not excite anyone. Or at least not anyone I know. They don't really help the business. So what are real reasons for this? Your customers, vendor security questionnaires, are probably going to ask about risk. Do you have a risk management program? That makes for easier sales if you can say yes and mean it. You know, the whole point is being able to make better decisions. It helps enable long-term planning. It helps you decide which risks to outsource. Like, say, you know, your core business has nothing to do with payment processing, so maybe you want to just skip the whole PCI thing and send it to Stripe or Square or whoever. And finally, you can fix the really dumb thing the co-founder likes, and it's going to cause problems later, but they really like it, but let's fix it early. The usual risk management advice assumes that you've got a lot of staff, and I'm telling you, we're not cheap. You've got some expertise. You may or may not have some expensive tools, and you have lots and lots and lots of time. And then there's the thing where they don't actually list this as something you need, but you kind of do. It's the organizational maturity. I don't mean just in the capability maturity model sense of, you know, you have a process, and you're aware of the process, and the process works, and stuff happens. There's also the not having the same freaking conversation about what is risk over and over and over again. And the same conversation about whether you can do information risk and information security with an intelligent adversary. Have y'all heard this conversation? Yeah, I'm friggin' tired of it. You know, give up, please. You know, and then there's the problem where those who are responsible for the risks are also accountable for them. If you don't have all of those, your risk management program is going to have a hard time. The current options for small and immature organizations are hire consultants. We like this option. We think that you should do it. There's Chad over there. My boss was at Hacker Pyramid. You know, we would love to help you. If you get other consultants, you might get something that looks a lot like the lots of time and staff and expertise, and maybe it's too much for your organization. You may get a controlled efficiency audit risk assessment. This is not a risk assessment. It's just a list of all the controls that think you ought to do that you aren't, and maybe there's a good reason you aren't, but you're still going to get dinged for it. This is also the other best thing about InfoSec, right? Yeah? And sometimes you get these like 800-page risk assessments. Anyone ever seen an 800-page risk assessment? You know, and you had like thousands of low risks and a few medium ones and one high one, and that was like super actionable and super helpful, right? Yeah. If you're in HIPAA, there's healthit.gov security risk assessment tool. And the only reason I mention this is I do recommend taking a look at it so you can see what would an auditor have to pass. The bar is low, my friends. You know, and then there's what most of us do. We kind of give up. We need something better. We need something that passes the audit. Okay, that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need something that's actually useful. We need something that's inexpensive if we're at a small scale, because we're not going to have a ton of money to throw at this necessarily. And it would be nice to have something that scales all the way up and all the way down, because changing how you handle risk in an organization is basically a pretty big deal organizational transformation project. How good is information security at spearheading organizational transformation projects? Yeah? And maybe not so much. So this is all my boss's idea. You might have heard of James Mercurial Arlen. He does Hacker Pyramid. He's really great. I'm the minion that built it out. We're using a hodgepodge of different resources. Don't worry about writing it down because there's a handout soonish. And the big players are factor analysis of information risk, binary risk assessment, the Canadian Harmonized Threat and Risk Assessment Methodology, because the Canadians are the best, and Australian Risk Management Standard. The basic plan, and we're going to go through in detail in a minute. Decide on scope, inventory assets and owners, sort the inventory by granularity, perform a binary risk assessment. Asset owners decide on the treatment for low and medium risks. Senior leadership reviews all the risks and decides on the highs, and then you document, document, document. And now for our actual program. And you guys, I totally nailed that timing. I totally did. I'm very excited. So our first step is deciding on the scope. Are you going to be audited? That's your scope. Are you subject to some kind of regulation, or have you signed contracts? That's your scope. Do your customers want you to protect their stuff? That's your scope. Do you want to protect your stuff? Might be your scope. But we do recommend that you kind of start small and grow. It would be nice to do everything. Eventually you'll do everything, but get things running before you try to do everything, if you can. If everything's in scope, then you're just going to have to cope. Then you inventory the assets and the owners. All I can say is that, yes, this is hard. This is something that we have been yelling about for a really long time. You need to know what you have anyway. This is one of those things where I'm kind of hoping that an extra reason for doing this, more compliancy, more whatever, will help get it done. But this is something where leadership skills, have them. The next thing you do is you sort the inventory by granularity. And this is the bit that we're stealing from the Canadian Threat and Risk Assessment Methodology, Appendix B, by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. That's what makes it great. And why are we doing this? We're doing this because you don't want to do that thing where you're comparing all of your servers to that one desktop running XP or whatever that you have to have because you've got, a million-year-old MRI that doesn't work with anything else, or I don't know. Sometimes you got to have it. A number of risk management programs are going to have you classify your assets by confidentiality, integrity, availability, sensitivity. That gets really hard to do. Other ones start talking about classifying your assets by business continuity criticality, or maybe sort of a presumed impact. And I think that's a bad idea because impact is also something you consider in your risk assessment. And then you're sorting your assets by that. And you get really recursive and really confused really fast. We're going with scale because it's a lot easier, and it also changes a lot less. If you're doing a database, suddenly your database can go from having not very high impact to all of your PCI data. That would kind of suck. But it's still database sized. And here's some granularities. I literally just took them from the back of that appendix. It's all written out there. You can adjust it for your organization. We're not saying you have to do it this way. But it's just start with, say, tangible assets at a high level, and then break it down into, you've got your data, you've got your hardware, you've got your software, you've got your facilities. And then you break it down a little more, and you're looking at the personal data, or your network components, or your buildings. And you break it down more, and you've got data centers, or all your Windows 10 operating systems, or all your firewalls. And you break it down more, and you've got specific credit card data, the specific iOS tablets that all your doctors are using, or whatever, all your execs are using, specific buildings. And just if you break stuff down, that helps you so you don't do that thing where you're comparing a data center to some handwritten notes that someone's likely to take. And then you do something called binary risk assessment. It was made by Ben Shapiro. It's online at binary.protect.io. It's Creative Commons license. It's free. You can use it commercially. It's fast. It's transparent. It's pretty compatible with other stuff. And it doesn't, okay, I said no training required. Will be done by the end of this talk. So it's minimal training is required. So using binary risk assessment as part of a program can be a little weird because there's not a lot of talk about this. This was really just discussed as a point kind of thing to do, a point assessment. But if you start at that subgroup level, like Windows 10 or your tablets, and just sort of work out, you pick an asset, you think of a probable scenario, not your movie plot threats, a probable scenario, ransomware, phishing, something like that. You need to do multiple assessments per asset. And because you can do them so fast, seriously, they take like 5 to 10 minutes, you can get in a lot of practice. And you can do multiple assessments per asset. And the reason for this is binary really only focuses on one narrow scenario at a time. That's also part of the reason when I first encountered risk stuff, my brain kind of exploded because it's like, well, this thing is really vulnerable to phishing, but it's not really vulnerable to viruses or whatever, And so you consider multiple assessments when the threats don't have the same objectives. Nation states are going to have a different objective from criminals or from hacktivists or whoever. The threats don't have the same capabilities. Nation states versus skitties versus squirrels. Or the threat events differ. Ransomware versus phishing can yield very different effects. And so here's a little philosophical segue. It's important for doing risk. What's the purpose of doing all this risk assessment? I have opinion on this, and so does the program I'm outlining. So if you've got a different opinion and you want to use this program, you need to just agree to disagree. When you're doing a lot of risk assessment, you probably are not the person who actually gets to be the decider. I cannot force people to patch their servers. I can encourage it very strongly. If needed, I can run it up the chain and make sure their management knows they're not patching their servers and what that problem is. But I cannot make them do it. It's also not terribly helpful to think that the only purpose for this is convincing other people that we're right. People get to disagree. If you're really, really invested in being right all the time, you probably aren't going to get much done. So that's my little philosophical discussion. The next step is the asset owners decide what to do about the low and medium risks. You've got all your assets with their owners. These are the people responsible for them. These are the people who can patch or not. Make them sign off that they're doing it. Make them sign off that they understand, hey, this is a risk, if it's a lower or medium risk. You have to let them make the wrong decisions. If it's a real problem, run it up the chain, but you have to let them make the wrong decisions. You cannot force them to do stuff. They don't want to, stand by those decisions, but we don't want to let them go either, and that's why we end up with this really awful tug of war with them saying, no, not going to patch, and us saying, well, you have to, and them saying, nope, not, and then everybody else saying, well, information security, why'd you let that happen? We never gave it up. This is another thing that, you want leadership skills, and it's probably the hardest part of any risk management program. So there are 4 basic ways to treat risk. You can avoid it. We're not saving that data in the first place. So we're not saving those pictures of the internal map of your house anywhere. So there's no chance we're going to sell them to anyone who wants that map of your house. If you've all heard about the Roomba, yeah, don't save it. You can mitigate it. You can add controls that reduce the possibility of something happened. Good examples of that are 2-factor authentication, network segmentation, stuff like that. You can transfer it by outsourcing to Square or Stripe, like I talked about before, or buying cyber insurance. Read your contract really carefully if you do that, kids. And then there's accept, by having someone at the right level agree that the organization is okay covering any losses. That's what it means to accept a risk. So what's the right level to sign off on a risk? It's kind of best to think of it like purchasing power. I can sign off on $200. You can sign off on $2 million. And anyone can sign off on, $2,000 meetings? Something like that. This is actually really hard to figure out when you're just starting. If you don't already know what risks you have or what they look like or what they feel like. Honestly, most people go by feel after a while. You don't know where to draw that line. A lot of programs want you to do it ahead of time. They call it risk appetite. That's the amount of loss exposure you're willing to run as a cost of doing business. It's really hard to figure out. And it's also something that if you try to figure it out in advance, you get really kind of wrapped up in abstractions, and you get really bored with the topic before you've even gotten to any useful decisions. So what I'm saying is just draw a line, change it later when you need to, because even if you figured out something beforehand, you'd get annoyed and you'd still have to change it later. The next step is you get a batch of these low and medium risks that have been signed off on at the appropriate level, and you get any high risks that you found, and you bring them all to senior leadership and throw them at them and say, here, you deal with it. That's how it works, right? Now, the senior leadership will review the low and medium risk decisions to know the context. This means that they can talk with people about the quality of their risk decisions, although this is also something to be careful of, because you really still have to work with people later, crazy talk. And then the senior leaders decide on the high risk. You still have to let them make wrong decisions. Your role here in this particular program is to identify problems and persuade. Another thing to keep in mind is that more high risks doesn't necessarily mean riskier assets. That's kind of a factor of how we've broken down our assets in that granularity step and how many scenarios we thought up. And risk aggregation is kind of a next level thing that almost no risk management program does well, and this doesn't do well until the end when you've got a lot of trained people who have learned to do it and are spending money. And then the last step is document all the things so you can drown your auditors in artifacts. So this is a point where please pass around the handouts. We are going to do a risk assessment. Are you excited? You're not sounding very excited. Yeah. No. If we're out, please share. Make friends. Talk to people. I know it's hard. So at 2:40 sharp, we're going to end because I have to finish it, but I'm pretty sure I can finish from them because I have nailed the timing twice now. It's very exciting. All right. So the thing about binary risk assessment, it's a series of 10 questions about a given asset and scenario. You don't necessarily need to be a risk expert or a security expert in order to answer them. It's fast enough that you can do more than one for each asset, which you need to do since you usually think of more than one reasonable scenario. What asset do we want to accept? We've actually got enough time that we can do several. I'll take suggestions, or we can assess a Windows 7 user desktop. Okay, I'm not seeing any burning suggestions, so let's just go with it. And what kind of scenario do we want to assess? Again, suggestions, or we can talk about ransomware. Sounds good? All right. Can you wait for the microphone? Sorry, I can't hear you at all.
So for the Windows 7, my wife is a controller at a company, so she accesses the bank information for the company. I think, how would that fit into this? Yeah.
Can we work through it first? Thanks.
Would that be part of this risk assessment?
Let's work through it. Okay, so if you look at your little binary work card, it's a very colorful side. Stop reading Alex Sutton's blog post. So Windows 7 ransomware. Can a ransomware attack be completed on Windows 7 with common skills? Yes? No? I'm not hearing any no's. It's up to you personally. I mean, the thing is these questions will help you argue with the business. Okay, they're like, what's a common skill? Why is this common or why is it not? This gives you a framework for talking about things. So you get to decide for yourself what it is. You know? So
if I'm the business, I would say no, because no one I know on my team would be able to actually.
And that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. And if you notice, most of the people in security said yes, I think because you can download it from ExploitDB. Yeah? And if you look, Michael Reutman from Canna.io has talked about how the likelihood of an exploit being actually used in the wild and actual causing problems, CVSS has nothing to do with it, whether it's in Metasploit and ExploitDB does. So when you go back to your team, you can talk with them and say, hey, yeah, I know that your guys can't do this, but anyone in the world who can download this can do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right then. Can the attack be completed without significant resources? Yes. And he knows. All right then. Is the asset undefended? It's a Windows 7 desktop, but it's on a little company network, and we've got a DMZ, and we've got a firewall. And so is it undefended?
Yes. Do any of your browsers go out to the internet? Yes. It's undefended.
And that's another one where you would have this discussion. And your line of business is probably going to look at you and say, then what am I paying you for if my laptop is undefended? And it's something to have an answer about, yeah?
Great, let's shut off all the browsers.
Awesome. That will go over really well. You know, are there known weaknesses in the current defenses? Yes. Because I like my tunes. I've got a Sonos, and Sonos for Windows requires SMB1. Woo-hoo! Yes, it does. You have a Sonos, don't you? Can the attack? Is the vulnerability in the asset always present? It's Windows 7. I'd go with yes. Anyone know? Can the attack be performed without meeting preconditions? Do you need something special to do that? Do you need to be there at a particular time? Do you know?
Users. We're flush.
You know, I would say that there's not a lot of preconditions here. You know, the Windows 7 machine needs to be turned on.
Yep.
People tend to leave them on all the time. I'm not sure that. You know, I would say yes, some without meeting preconditions, but that's also something that you can have a discussion about, and you can actually talk about it. All right, so like, if you followed along, where'd that land? High? Yeah, so we're high on the likelihood here. Let's talk about magnitude, and this is where your question about the bank goes. Will there be consequences from internal sources? We've got ransomware inside. Yes. Will there be consequences from external sources? Are you sure? Maybe, yeah. And this is a yes-no thing. This is another thing where you can have a really good discussion with the business. How likely is there to be a problem that gets out? Yeah?
If you did that, would you look at like last X years attempts or incidences, or like how would you actually have an argument there?
It would depend. Like maybe if your company has ever had a ransomware attack that got into the news, that's going to be a yes because people will have been burned. If you haven't, you may have to argue. You may need to discuss it on the basis of other companies. You may need to discuss it on, you know, like your friends' companies, whatever, just the history. You know, this is a framework for having discussion. It's not going to be all the answers. You know, does the asset have or create significant business value? It's somebody's desktop. Is Is the ransomware, is this work significant necessarily? You know? Right, yeah. So maybe not. You know, on the other hand, if it's the one connecting to bank stuff and the ransomware travels, maybe? It depends on your individual circumstances. And again, this is something you can have a conversation about. Will the repair or replacement cost be significant? No. Depending, yeah. Yeah. One laptop, no, the other not. But, huh?
How much Bitcoin do you have?
Only Ethereum, baby. I have none of them. But, so, how did that one land in your handy little work card? And we argued a little more about some of them. So it might have been medium, it might have been high, but you're probably coming out with a high risk of ransomware on a Windows 7 desktop, yeah? And then you can have, your ops people are like, yeah, but we don't want to upgrade. This works for us. We don't need to upgrade. It costs money. Besides, the Windows 10 is spying on you. And it totally is, and we don't want to make this change. Isn't Microsoft keeping us updated? We're not end of life yet. But now you have a framework for talking about the issues and working your way through it. So, is this perfect? No. Is this good enough to start a conversation? Okay, that's good, because I did kind of feel like I was talking to myself a lot. I do that, but me, myself, and I had a great conversation. Hopefully you enjoyed it as well. We have 7 minutes to try and do another one. You want to do another one?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. Okay.
As we're doing this next one, so item 3 and 4 on here, I see there's like 3 categories of 3 sets of low, medium,
Yeah.
high. How do you get between the low, medium, and low, high? I guess I did miss that part.
If it's, talk to me later, because I kind of need to point at the picture. Sorry. It's just I'm not sure that'll be, I'm not 100% I understand your question when we need to point at the picture and it gets confusing and stuff. So,
I actually have the same question that might help frame it, which is how did we go from the sort of simple matrix above to the more under 3 and 4 to the more complex matrix under 3 and 4? Like, how do you interpret that?
oh, okay, there's determined likelihood. And so
Yep.
you get all the way to bottom after 6 and you've determined likelihood.
Sorry.
And then there's,
If I'm understanding you, I'm actually just talking about the moving from 2 to 3 under determined likelihood. If I
Okay,
move between
so-
2 and 3,
Okay.
after I get through 3 and 4, it's more complex. How do we interpret that?
all right, let's talk more about the original scenario instead of trying to do a new one. Can the attack be completed without common skills? Yes. Can the attack be completed without significant resources? Yes. If I'm misremembering anybody, what we decided, just yell. So yes and yes is a high. Is the asset undefended? Yes. Are there known weaknesses in the current defenses? Yes. So that's also high. So, yeah.
Are you carrying,
Where do you put the high
Yeah.
from the first one?
are you carrying forward the first 2
Yes.
into the second?
Yeah, so you've done the high, and then you're in that column with the high. And if it's no, you can go down to medium. But if it's yes, no, or yes, you stay in high. And then for the next 2 questions, the same thing. It's a vulnerability in the asset always present? Yes. Can the attack be performed without meeting preconditions? Yes. Is that making a lot more sense to people? And then you do the same thing on the impact side, and then you take your likelihood and impact and put them and smush them together and create Voltron. You got it? All right. So I'm not, yeah.
I had a question. So let's say that you have. Just to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. So for under determined impact for the external sources, would you say that if you have requirements to disclose any sort of information security incident, that would fall under a consequence of external sources?
Personally, I would go for that, yeah. But it could be that whatever disclosure you're doing just isn't going to go anywhere. And you don't care that much. So maybe not. It's your personal determination of what is significant, and you get to argue about what's significant. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Awesome. So I don't know that we're going to have time to do another one, but if there's time at the end and there aren't questions, there's going to be questions. Never mind, forget that. All right. So we've done this, and we had a nice conversation, but there were obvious weaknesses here, right? It doesn't actually meet the definition of risk that I talked about, probable frequency and probable magnitude of future loss. It's not quite there. It's kind of close, but it's not quite there. The questions are pretty technology focused, not people or processes. You can do PEDCAC, obviously, but, really talking about administrative processes is going to be pretty hard with this. It's kind of hard to answer for the non-malicious threats. It's going to be really ambiguous regarding those secondary losses, like reporting requirements. If there's a breach, whether or not, let's say you've got a lost laptop. That's not supposed to have personal data on it, but maybe it does. So those secondary losses only happen some of the time. But when they do happen, they can greatly outstrip the cost of any primary losses from losing something. And it's kind of weirdly ambiguous between low frequency, high magnitude risks. And we picked a high frequency, high magnitude risk, so it wasn't quite as obvious. But if you pick something that's low frequency and high magnitude, like say, your rogue DBA, that almost never happens because we've got other processes supposedly to take care of it. And also, to be honest, most people are reasonably honest and stuff, so that's a low frequency risk. But high magnitude, there ain't nothing you're going to do if your DBA decides to flip. So it's kind of ambiguous. But I did say that this was going to scale. And what you do is you add factor analysis of information risk. It's made by Jack Jones. It's the open group standard for risk management. It's free to read all about it, or you can buy the book for $40 or whatever it is. That's essentially free. There's a sliding scale for commercial use, and it's not completely unlikely that an organization would already have it because Open Group also does TOGAF and some other stuff that's pretty established. The training is pretty inexpensive. It's way cheaper than SANS, and if you're an ISC squared, you get it 50% off, so it's even cheaper than that. You can do it qualitative or quantitatively. It doesn't require special vendor tools, although you can get them. They're kind of cool. And it's not as fast as binary, but one assessment takes about 2 hours. How many of you have done a risk assessment in your organization that involves answering 200 million questions? Yeah? Did it only take 2 hours? No. That's the question. So FAIR is the best framework for risk management and the best methodology for risk assessment. I'm not going to argue about it. Let's take it outside. So here's how you add FAIR. The amazing thing about FAIR is that the way you scope a FAIR scenario is the exact same way you would scope a binary scenario. They have to be pretty narrow. You need one asset and not just one threat event, but one threat event model, one type of threat event. What that means is that FAIR can be a drop-in replacement for a single binary assessment. You can still binary all the things and only do FAIR when you need more information, more rigor, more usefulness. That means you're only doing extra work when you have to. That's pretty cool. So how do you start with FAIR? The analyst training really helps. I have been doing risk for years and years and years, and I needed the actual training. I had all the books and stuff. I read it. I'm like, this is awesome. I get it. I don't get it. I needed the training. It helps. It's pretty cheap. Just do it or send somebody. Everything is all in the open FAIR body of knowledge. Qualitative assessments only need pen and paper. If you want to do quantitative assessments, they can be done with Excel. You can do them with R. You can do them with Python. Or RiskLens, which is the commercial end of the fair stuff. They do have a tool. It's really cool. You can use it, but you don't have to. Because one of the things we were going for is this would be, at least start, really inexpensive. The thing here is you keep doing binary on everything. And then you do fair as well in a few things you needed. And there's still a reason to do binary first. First of all, that was really fast, right? It's not a hardship to do it. It also helps you make sure that you've got your scope and what you're thinking about nailed down. So just do binary for everything and then add fair as you need it. So how far can you go with fair? How far do you want to go in your risk management? It will support pretty much the highest levels of risk management complexity and maturity. I know insurance companies who they're using fair. It can be fully quantitative. You can do all the numbers all the time, and they're actually like reasonable numbers instead of like that kind of numbers. And one of the really, really difficult questions in risk management is, well, how do I know the risk for the whole organization? How much risk do I have? You can aggregate it, and it'll work in the tool. Here's the book. It's noted on the handout, the reference for it. And finally, we have to document. The external documentation that you'll need is the binary risk assessment from binary.protect.io. Again, that's free. Harmonized threat and risk assessment methodology from Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Appendix B. That's also free. Fair standards from the Oakham Group. Free to read, sliding scale for commercial use. Fair training, way, way cheaper than SANS. Or that's the main risk management training I know of. It's cheaper than most stuff. RiskLens platform, I have no idea what that costs. Ask them if you want it, but it's way far into the future. You've got to maintain some audit artifacts. I know you're super excited about this. Yeah. You're going to need a system of record, some kind of workflow tool, or maybe just a conscientious assistant, an office suite. You need a policy. You need a process. You need some templates for storing the risk assessment. You need some forms or templates or whatever for the risk decisions. You need a risk register because everybody wants a risk register. And you need meeting minutes from those review meetings. Your risk management policy, you're going to want to have what the purpose of the program is. The actual scope. So the auditors don't say, hey, why didn't you review this? And you're like, that's out of scope. You didn't tell me what the scope is. Here's a finding. Statement that you'll actually treat the risks to reduce them to an acceptable level. Statement that asset owners are the ones that accept the risks, that decide on the risk treatments. What the requirements are for your organization. How often to perform risk assessments and how often to review the risks and their treatment decisions. Your risk management process, we just walked through that whole thing. The only change is perform binary risk assessment and maybe fair if you want some more cool stuff. Yeah? You'll also want to document whatever the process is for making and signing off on risk treatment decisions, both at the asset owner level and at the more senior level. Process for reviewing risk decisions, because every year you got to review your risk decision, that kind of stuff. And it helps to have a RACI matrix, responsible, accountable, consulted, informed on who's supposed to be doing what. So your policy doesn't, and processes don't read as if invisible fairies are in performing all these tasks, because that's a really common failure mode for policies and processes. The risk management process owner would be the person who's accountable for the risk management process, not the risks, unless they happen to own the asset. Sometimes they do, but not usually. And then the process manager, or whatever you want to call them, is the minion that does all the work. And the target asset owner is the person who owns the asset. And the target asset manager is the sysadmin who does all the work. And then finally, you want to name the executive person, senior leader, whatever, who's accountable for information risk in your organization. Who gets the orange jumpsuit? Or who is responsible for the organization not just completely imploding due to an information security problem? You need some kind of consistent way to store a risk assessment. It can be Excel, it can be Word, it can be in your Jira workflow tool, whatever. but some consistent way to store it so, you can keep track. It's standardized way to document an assessment. You also need a standardized way to document the risk treatment decision plans. And, what was the asset? What was the scenario we were talking about? What risk did we find? Here's what the decision is. Here's the people who are going to do stuff. Here's the project plan, whatever. And then you also get some kind of signature, some kind of, I'm accountable for this, You need a risk register because every auditor is going to ask for that probably by name. It's just a list of all your risks and all the decisions made. And then for those exciting, fun review meetings, you need minutes to prove that you had the meeting, prove that you did the review, and document any decisions made. We made it. Does this work? Yeah. No, really, does this work? We've implemented this at clients. It helps them teach themselves about risk. It helps them teach themselves how to talk to each other about risk and how to make decisions. It's really, really cool. It gets accountability and authority actually aligned instead of, we didn't patch, but it's your problem. It lets decision makers drive the depth of analysis and the amount of work based on what information they need and want to make decisions, instead of trying to run this huge 2 million question program or whatever, and everybody's like, what do you do with this? I don't care. And it keeps the investment of time, resources, personnel in line with the value. Does it work with Leviathan? We hope so. If you would like to talk with us again, we'd love to talk with you and help. We are going to be releasing white paper and blog posts more about how to do this. It was just, let's get the talk and see if what questions were missing and stuff like that. But y'all probably know my boss, James Arlen. He does Hacker Pyramid. Talk to him. And that's it. Any exciting questions? Yes.
Why is risk register important? I can't get a straight answer on this.
Because the auditors want it, and sometimes you just need to do the auditor bang.
But aren't you shedding light on, you're creating exposure to the auditors on what your issues are?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Is that, are you asking if it's cheating for the auditors to ask you where all your weaknesses are?
Exactly. Yes.
It is cheating. They're
Yes.
auditors. You kind of stuck with it.
Because you're sharing your,
that's kind of how it is. One of the things with auditing is consider what kind of fines people have gotten for the most part. They're a slap on the wrist. The point of auditing has been mostly to ensure that you're doing processes. If you get a finding, it's probably not that big a deal. With auditing, they would rather know that you are aware of particular issues. And if it's properly accepted, then a lot of times they'll go over it and say, you did that. It's very rare for auditors to start talking about your decision quality, unless you've had a big problem. Or unless you're PCI and you have a breach and therefore you were clearly never PCI compliant, even though you were certified every year for the past 10 years. Yes? Did that answer your question? It's kind of the way things are. You do need to tell them where your problems are. You just have to. It's not fair. That's how it is. Yeah.
When we do our risk assessments, one of the things we find is that our business owners, once we've extrapolated the impact and the likelihood, it kind of gets into that that stoplight, that high, medium, low kind of area. And at the end of the day, we say this whatever is high risk, and we present it back to them, and they go, okay, now what? They try to figure it out. So one thing we have found though is all of our business stakeholders really understand dollars. They understand, okay, well, how will this affect me? But I've not found an easy way to de-extrapolate it back down to what that real likely or what that real impact is in a dollar value, whether it's reputational risk or whether it's a cost of a breach or something. Do you have any tips on that?
That's where the fair. What's going on? Can I talk now? Oh, okay. So that's where the fair analysis comes in. That will give you dollar values. That will help. Part of the reason for this is the quick and dirty version is to get people talking about issues and why you're having this issue, why it's a problem. Like I said, it's not perfect. This is supposed to be a good enough. One of the problems with us risk people, and I've been as guilty as anyone else, is like the perfect is the enemy of the just getting by. And at least with this, you'll have broken down things more to talk about where the issues are. Well, part of this risk is coming from the fact that there are known weaknesses in the current defenses. Let's change that so there aren't any known weaknesses, and look, it goes down to low. And they're like, oh, I can accept that. How expensive is that change? Well, you turn on Windows Update. All right then.
Okay, thanks.
Does that help? Yeah.
So to add a little bit to my wife is the accountant and controller thing. Thanks to her relationship with me, she knows all about phishing emails to get someone to do a transfer overseas kind of thing. So she's very cognizant and aware of that. With the binary risk assessment example that you used, it was assuming evil hackers as opposed to just good social engineering. So I'm struggling a little bit with how do you apply it for assessing the risk that my wife as a human being gets hacked as opposed to a technical asset.
That is part of the weakness of binary risk assessment is it's not as good with people. Although, with the phishing example, I mean, who does phishing? Non-evil hackers, it's still evil hackers. It's just a different vector. And, that's one of the weaknesses in binary. You can go and say, okay, can the attack be completed with common skills? Is a good phishing attempt a common skill? Yes, no. I mean, this is a hard thing to think through, Can a good phishing attempt be completed without significant resources? That one I'd say yeah. Is the asset undefended? Well, we have security awareness every year, and we have fake phishing attempts, and the rate of clicks has gone down. So the asset is not undefended. Are there no weaknesses? Well, yeah, they're people. Is a vulnerability in the asset always present? You can actually make an argument that that's no, because a lot of the times with phishing attempts, people do catch them, and it's just occasionally they get through because, you get the DFL or the FedEx phishing attempt right when you're expecting a package. That's kind of luck. So maybe for that, you say the vulnerability is not always present. Can the attack be performed without meeting preconditions? And phishing, yeah, they're kind of our preconditions. So, you can still think it through. It's kind of a proxy. It's kind of approximate. It's not perfect, but it's good enough to do a risk assessment and be able to talk about stuff. Does that make sense? Awesome.
Right, that has to be the last question.
Oh, no. Okay.